I came back from church and found a strange white truck in my driveway, blocking the view of my own front door. Two men in gray t-shirts were carrying my sofa down the steps, the one my husband and I had bought the year we paid off the mortgage. For a second, I thought I'd turned onto the wrong street. Then I saw my rose bush, the crack in the third step, the crooked mailbox with my name on it. It was my house. They were carrying my life out of my house. "Excuse me," I heard my own voice, thinner than I wanted. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" The taller mover barely glanced at me. "Ma'am, please stay clear of the ramp. We don't want you getting hurt." He said it the way nurses talk to confused patients. I stepped closer anyway, clutching my purse with both hands. At 72, your body moves a little slower, but your anger doesn't. "This is my furniture," I said. "That is my sofa. This is my house. Who hired you?" He shifted the weight on his shoulder, impatient. "Look, Mrs. He squinted at the clipboard. "Mrs. Parker, right? Your son, Mark. Everything's in the order. Maybe go inside and talk to him, okay?" For a moment, my mind refused the words. Mark. My boy, who used to fall asleep on that very sofa with peanut butter on his chin. My boy who now texted me more than he called. Always busy. "He's inside?" I asked. "Was. Couple minutes ago. Said he had to run back to the other place to meet the realtor." The mover shrugged. "We're just doing our job." The other place. The realtor. The words buzzed around my head like flies. I walked past them, straight up the steps, ignoring their muttered, "Careful, ma'am." My front door was wide open, banging softly in the breeze. The hallway looked wrong in that instant, like someone had taken a familiar song and cut out every third note. The pictures from the wall were gone. The little table where I kept my keys was gone. Only the pale rectangles on the wallpaper showed where things had been. In the living room, the emptiness hit harder. One wall already bare, the bookcase half stripped, the TV gone, boxes taped and labeled in a handwriting I knew too well. Kitchen, bedroom, linen closet, my linen closet, my sheets, my towels, the tablecloth I only used on Christmas. There was a woman I barely recognized standing in the middle of the room. It took me a second to realize she was me, reflected in the dark glass of the empty TV stand. Hair too gray, shoulders too narrow, eyes too shocked. I looked away and reached for my phone. Mark picked up on the third ring. "Hey, Mom. Did Pastor Jim keep you late again?" His voice was light, cheerful, the way people talk right before they do something cruel. "Mark," I said, surprised at how steady I sounded. "There is a truck at my house. There are men carrying out my things. They say you hired them." He was silent for a beat. I could picture him pinching the bridge of his nose like he always did when something inconvenienced him. "Yeah, I was going to call you tonight," he said. "Listen, Mom, don't get upset. This is for your own good." I walked slowly to the window and watched the men load my sofa, the cushions askew like a knocked-over body. Somewhere in the street, a child was riding a bicycle, laughing. Life went on, indifferent. "For my own good," I repeated, "without telling me." "You get so anxious, Mom," he sighed. "Last time we tried to talk about the house, you nearly cried. Lindsay said we should just handle it and spare you the stress." Of course, Lindsay had a say. My daughter-in-law always had a say, especially about things that weren't hers. "What are you handling?" I asked. "Be very clear with me, Mark." I heard voices on his end, the ping of a car unlocking. "We're moving you out today," he said. "Just the big things. Lindsay found a great place, assisted living, but really nice. Activities, nurses on call, You'll make friends. And we can put the house on the market while the market's still good. I am standing, I said slowly, in my own living room, in my own house. I have not agreed to move anywhere. You do not get to sell my home while I'm at church. He gave a little laugh that wasn't a laugh at all. Mom, come on. You gave me power of attorney, remember? After Dad died? I'm just using it to take care of things you can't handle anymore. Something cold slid down my spine. I remembered that day. His hand on mine, pen in my fingers, the blur of grief and hospital bills. It's just for the bills, he'd said back then, just so you don't have to worry. I gave you the right to pay my utilities, I said, not to empty my house while my back is turned. Mom, you're being dramatic. His voice hardened. You forget things. You fell last month, remember? You called Chloe in tears because you couldn't get off the floor. What if that happens again? What if no one is here? I remembered. I also remembered that I had slipped on water I'd spilled while carrying a vase, and that I had crawled to the phone, and yes, cried. Getting old is not glamorous, but I had stood up afterward, on my own 2 feet. I will decide, I said, every word and effort, when I leave this house. Not you, not your wife. Certainly not some realtor. Mom, he started. I hung up. My hand was shaking, not from age this time, but from fury. I stared at the phone screen, at his name, then jabbed 3 numbers I'd never dialed in 68 years of living in this town. 911, what is your emergency? My name is Helen Parker, I said. I'm 72 years old. While I was at church, someone hired movers to empty my house without my consent. I need an officer here, right now. I looked at the truck outside, at the strangers carrying my life in cardboard boxes. And please, I added, tell them to hurry. There isn't much left to steal. The police arrived before the movers could empty my bedroom, but not before they'd carried off half of my living room. 2 patrol cars pulled up, lights off, doors slamming shut with that heavy finality I'd heard only in crime shows. A young officer approached me first, hand resting lightly on his belt, eyes scanning the open doorway as if expecting a bear to wander out. Ma'am, we got a call. You reported unauthorized removal of property. Yes, I said, and felt my voice steady just from having someone look at me as if I still mattered. Those men are taking my furniture without my consent. My son hired them, but I did not agree to any of this. The officer nodded slowly, then motioned to his partner, an older man with weary eyes. They stepped inside together, the younger one speaking to the movers, the older one speaking to me. Mrs. Parker, right? He asked gently. Your son says he has power of attorney. He has a limited one, I replied. To pay bills, not to steal my life out from under me. He exhaled, and I could tell this wasn't his first family disaster. Do you have the paperwork? It's inside. I walked past him into the kitchen, feeling strangely exposed in my own home. The drawers were open. Someone had rifled through them, probably the movers looking for small valuables. My breath hitched at the sight of my husband's watchbox sitting crooked on the counter, empty. I handed the officer the folder with the documents. Paper trembles when your fingertips tremble. He skimmed through, brow furrowing. This is indeed limited, he murmured. Doesn't authorize sale or relocation. Exactly, I said. And yet here we are. The younger officer joined us. The movers have paperwork showing the son's signature, but they understand they need authorization from the homeowner if there's a dispute. He hesitated. But ma'am, do you have any cognitive issues we should be aware of? There it was, the soft knife. I straightened my back. I remember my name, my address, my birthday, and the fact that my son is trying to evict me without my consent. Does that sound confused to you? He flushed. No, ma'am. The older officer stepped outside to call his supervisor. The younger one tried to manage the movers who were now huddled by the truck, glancing at me as if I were the villain of this piece. I stood in the doorway of my own home and felt the long, cold shadow of my son's choices wrap around me. My phone buzzed again. Mark. I let it ring. Then it buzzed again and again, as if he could force my compliance through persistence. Finally, I answered. Mom, he said sharply, the officers are misunderstanding the situation. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. The only difficulty, I replied, is that you forgot I'm alive. He groaned. Please don't start. You know you can't manage this house anymore. Lindsay and I have been talking about this for months. You've been talking, I corrected. Not listening. You nearly fell last month. And I got up. He paused. Mom, you're being unreasonable. This is happening. We already put down a deposit on the assisted living place. It's a good one. People your age thrive there. You won't be lonely. Mark, I said softly, I wasn't lonely until today. He said nothing. The silence stretched, brittle and ugly. Outside, the older officer hung up his phone and approached us. Ma'am, he said, we've spoken with our supervisor. Until the legal authority is clarified, the movers must stop. They can't remove anything else today. A small victory, but it felt like a lungful of clean air. The movers lowered the dresser they were carrying and backed off. One of them looked almost relieved. Conflict is harder than lifting oak furniture. Mark was still on the line. Mom, he hissed, hearing the officer's words. What are you doing? If you make this official, things get complicated. You won't like where this ends. Maybe not, I said. But I'm beginning to understand that avoiding complications only benefits the people taking advantage of me. You're overreacting. And you're underestimating me. Another silence. Then a clipped, angry exhale. Fine. If this is how you want to play it. He hung up. I stared at my dim phone screen until my reflection faded into the glare from the open doorway. The officers stayed long enough to document what had already been taken and give me a case number. The movers packed up reluctantly, muttering that they'd be in touch with the client. When the last truck door slammed, the house fell too quiet. A half-stripped room echoes. In a way a full room never does. I walked to where my sofa had been and lowered myself slowly to the floorboards. Dust outlines of furniture surrounded me like chalk drawings at a crime scene. My hands rested in my lap. My heartbeat slowed, and it occurred to me, not with fear, but with a strange, steady calm, that this was only the beginning. That night, the house felt like it was holding its breath with me. Every missing object created a hollow space that my eyes kept falling into. The empty spot where the sofa had been, the pale rectangles on the wall where photographs once hung, the echo of my steps in a room that had never echoed before. A house remembers the weight of furniture. When that weight is gone, the silence rings. I made myself a cup of tea because I didn't know what else to do. The kettle's whistle had always been comforting, but now even that thin, tired sound scraped against my nerves. I sat at the kitchen table, wrapping my hands around the mug for warmth, though the house wasn't cold. It was just emptier. Not of furniture, but of certainty. I had spent years trusting that Mark knew where my boundaries were. Perhaps that was the first mistake, assuming he still saw them. On the table lay the folder with the documents I had shown the officers. I pulled it closer, opened it, and began sorting through the papers. Grief makes people careless. I could see that now in the way I had signed things years ago, eyes cloudy with exhaustion after my husband died. One by one, I smoothed out the pages, rereading lines I had never properly understood before. Power of attorney for financial management only, the document stated. I ran my fingertip along the words. No mention of real estate, no mention of relocation, no permission to decide the fate of my home. The house creaked as the wind shifted outside. It was the same old sound I'd heard for decades, but tonight it felt like the house was agreeing with me. I reached into the drawer beneath the table and pulled out my checkbook, the old leather cover frayed at the corners. Beneath it were envelopes of tax returns, medical bills, insurance statements. I found the deed to the house, a little yellowed around the edges but still solid. My husband's signature next to mine. That alone steadied my breath. The phone buzzed again. I didn't want to answer, but habit made me look. Not Mark. Lindsay. I let it go dark without touching it. Straightening the stack of documents, I noticed a scrap of paper stuffed between two folders. It was a note from my husband, written years ago in his small, precise handwriting. Check the furnace filter. Call the plumber if it's still noisy. Love you. Life, in the end, is made of such small sentences. I held the note for a moment, letting the warmth of memory soften the bitterness in my chest. But remembering my husband also made me realize something else. He had trusted me to manage this home, not hand it over to anyone else, not even our son. I closed the folders, put them back in the drawer, and walked slowly down the hall toward the bedroom. The movers had taken my dresser but left the bed. Apparently, even forced relocation had limits. I sat on the edge of the mattress and let out a long breath I didn't know I'd been holding. My knees ached when I bent to take off my shoes. My feet felt swollen. That fall Mark kept bringing up had happened because I'd been rushing, not because I was incapable. But to him, one moment of weakness was all the evidence he needed to declare me unfit. I lay back and stared at the ceiling. A nail hole glinted in the faint streetlight, seeping through the curtains. There had been a picture of us there. My husband holding me, both of us younger, full of plans. I imagined that picture riding away in the back of the truck, rattling around between boxes labeled in my son's handwriting. It felt like a small betrayal layered on top of a larger one. The clock on the nightstand ticked steadily. At some point, I must have drifted into sleep, because I woke to the sound of a car door slamming outside. My heart jumped before my mind fully caught up. I pushed myself up, crossed the room, and looked out from behind the curtain. It wasn't Mark, just a neighbor arriving home late, headlights sweeping across my yard. Still, the moment made something inside me settle. Fear always arrives first, like an instinct. But dignity follows if you give it a chance. I turned on the small lamp by my bed and picked up my phone. I scrolled past Mark's messages, past Lindsay's, until I found the contact for the bank, the one I had used only once before, years ago. Then my finger moved to the attorney search page I'd opened earlier. My hands were steady now, calmer than they'd been all day. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow I would start untangling all the knots my son had tied while assuming I wouldn't notice. I placed the phone on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and lay back down. The house seemed to exhale with me, settling into the dark. For the first time since the movers appeared on my steps, I felt something close to resolve forming inside my chest. I wasn't done yet. By morning, the fear had drained out of me and left something firmer in its place. Not anger exactly, but a kind of tired steadiness. I moved slowly through the kitchen, touching the edges of the empty spaces where things had been, letting my hands learn the contours of this new, disrupted version of my home. It was strange how quickly a room could begin to feel foreign when someone else had laid their hands on it without permission. I sat down at the table with a notepad and pen, old habits from the days when bills were paid by envelope, and wrote a simple list: bank, documents, attorney. I didn't need to write Mark. He hovered in every line of ink whether I wrote his name or not. The bank opened at 9. I arrived at 8:30. Unwilling to give myself time to reconsider. Banks always smelled the same: paper, disinfectant, and something metallic from the coin drawers. A young man in a navy suit approached me with that trained politeness I'd seen 1,000 times. "How can I help you today, ma'am?" "I need to review all recent account activity," I said, "and I'd like to verify who has access to my information." He led me to a small desk with a computer and a stiff chair. His fingers clicked briskly across the keys until he found my profile. Then his expression shifted, just slightly, in a way people can't completely hide. "Your son has been receiving duplicate statements," he said carefully, "forwarded to an alternate address, authorized under the power of attorney." I swallowed. "Which address?" He hesitated. "It appears to be his home." I folded my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. "What else?" The clicking resumed. "There were attempts, unsuccessful but attempts, to initiate refinancing on your property. The bank requested full documentation from the legal owner," he glanced at me, "which we never received, so the process stalled." My breath came shallow. Mark had tried to refinance my home behind my back. The house my husband and I had built, piece by piece, dollar by dollar. The house I had kept after George died because it was the one place that still felt like him. "Mrs. Parker," the banker said softly, "do you want to revoke his access?" I looked down at my hands. The veins stood out sharply, like blue threads pulled too tight. I had spent years letting things slip, smoothing them over, telling myself that letting Mark manage the paperwork was simply easier. Maybe that worked for him. Maybe he counted on it. "Yes," I said. "Revoke everything that can be revoked immediately." He nodded and began opening forms. More clicking, more papers sliding across the desk for my signature. Each one made a quiet, final sound as my pen touched it, like doors closing gently, one by one. When we finished, he slid the folder toward me. "If you plan on pursuing any legal action," he said, "you'll want copies of everything." "I plan to find out exactly what my rights are," I replied. It was the closest I had come to saying the truth. I was done letting my son steer my life as if I were a piece of worn furniture he couldn't decide whether to keep or throw out. Outside, the morning sun felt too bright. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, adjusting to it, before calling the number the bank had recommended the day before, a legal aid clinic that offered consultations for seniors. A calm woman answered, scheduled an appointment within the hour, and gave me the address. The office was in an old brick building with mismatched tiles on the floor. A young receptionist showed me to a small waiting area where a ficus plant drooped in the corner, as if it, too, was weary from hearing too many small tragedies. I didn't have to wait long before a woman in her 40s came toward me, hand extended. "Mrs. Parker, I'm Attorney Mills. Let's talk." Her office was crowded with files, books, half-drunk cups of coffee, and 2 framed certificates slightly askew. But there was an order to it, the kind that comes from fighting other people's battles for so many years that clutter stops feeling like chaos. "Tell me what happened," she said. So I did. Not dramatically, not accusingly, just the events, step by step. The movers, the police, the documents. my son's voice telling me this was for my own good. Attorney Mills listened intently, nodding at certain moments, scribbling notes at others. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. Mrs. Parker, let me be very clear. A limited financial power of attorney does not grant your son the right to remove your belongings, relocate you, or initiate the sale of your home. He acted outside his legal authority. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. We can file a report documenting the unauthorized removal of property, she continued. We can notify law enforcement of the attempted misuse of the power of attorney, and you should revoke that power immediately, which you've already started with the bank. My throat tightened. Will this escalate things with my son? It may, she said gently, but what he did has already escalated something. You're simply reclaiming your rights. I nodded slowly. Reclaiming. It was a word I hadn't used about myself in a long time. Attorney Mills gathered the papers I'd brought and organized them into a neat stack. The next step is preparing written notice. We'll also need to identify where your belongings were taken. I knew the answer. I had seen the address scrawled on the mover's clipboard. I repeated it to her. She wrote it down without hesitation, her pen scratching across the page like a promise. For the first time that day, I felt a flicker of something warm in my chest. Not hope exactly. Something steadier. Something like the first stone placed back into the foundation of a house someone tried to tear apart while I wasn't looking. When I left the attorney's office, the air felt sharper, almost metallic, like the air before a storm. I wasn't frightened anymore. I wasn't even angry in the way I had been yesterday. It was something narrower now, heavier, but cleaner, a kind of resolve, as if a line had finally been drawn inside me, and I knew I wasn't going to step back over it, not even for my son. I drove home slowly, watching the familiar streets pass by. Houses with trimmed hedges, porch swings, mailbox posts, leaning a little from years of weather. I used to think the neighborhood was shrinking around me, that I was outgrowing the world by aging inside it. But today, it felt larger than I remembered. Maybe because, for the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to disappear into the background of my own life. Inside the house, the stillness met me like a question. I set my purse on the counter, sat at the kitchen table again, and looked around at the scratches on the floor where the movers had dragged my furniture out. Marks of someone else's haste, someone else's decisions. The attorney had told me to write down everything I remembered, times, details, conversations. So I took out a notebook and began to write. My handwriting had grown a little shaky over the years, but the words came clearly. I wrote about the truck in the driveway, about the officer's face when he read my documents, about the way Mark's voice tightened when I told him no. When I finished, I rested the pen on the page and listened to the house breathe around me. The refrigerator hum, the faint drumming of a branch against the window, the clock's soft, measured beats. A home always knows when it's been threatened, but it also knows when its owner has decided to stand her ground. I made myself a sandwich, though I wasn't hungry, and ate half before wrapping the rest and putting it back in the fridge. Old habits. Then I washed my hands and looked at my reflection in the small window above the sink. My hair needed brushing. My eyes looked a little sunken, but steady, like the eyes of a woman who has finally stopped apologizing for existing. The phone buzzed again. Mark. I let it vibrate until it stopped. A moment later, Lindsay's name appeared. I let that one go too. They could wait. They had rushed things for so long, pushing, deciding, cornering. They could wait for me now. The attorney had told me one important thing. I had every right to secure my home. So I called a locksmith. A young man arrived that afternoon. cheerful, unaware that he was stepping into the ruins of a small domestic battle. "Want all the locks replaced?" he asked as he unpacked his tools. "Yes," I said, "every external door." He worked quickly, humming under his breath, and when he handed me the new keys, cool and bright in my palm, I felt something heavy loosen inside my chest. I paid the bill, thanked him, and watched his van pull away before closing the door and turning the new lock myself. The click echoed like a declaration. For the first time in days, I breathed easily. In the living room, the spaces where my furniture had been looked less like wounds and more like openings, waiting for something that belonged there, not something forced out by someone else's plans. I walked over to the window and looked at the yard. The afternoon light was beginning to soften, gold pooling along the fence, the grass moving in small, gentle waves. My husband used to mow that lawn with steady, methodical stripes. I could almost hear the loud hum of the mower, his slow concentration. He would have hated what Mark had done. Not the decision itself. Men of his generation believed in practicality, but the way it was done, the secrecy, the presumption, the disrespect. I traced the windowsill with my fingertips. The paint was chipped in one corner. I remembered how my husband had touched that same spot once, promising he'd repaint it next spring. He never got the chance. A knock sounded at the door. 3 quick taps, familiar and hesitant. I didn't need to look to know who it was. My granddaughter, Chloe, had always knocked like that. Too polite to barge in, too eager to wait long. I opened the door. She stood there with her backpack slung over one shoulder, her expression twisted with worry. "Grandma," she said quietly, "Dad told me you overreacted yesterday." I stepped aside to let her in. "Is that what he said?" She set her bag down. "He said you got confused, that you weren't handling things well. He sounded frustrated." I met her eyes. She had her father's jawline, but not his coldness. "I wasn't confused," I said. "I was blindsided." She sat at the table, folding her hands. "I figured. Dad and Lindsay have been talking about selling your place for months. They didn't think you'd take it well, so they planned around you." "Planned over me," I corrected softly. She nodded, eyes down. "Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't know they were going to do something like this. You're not responsible for their choices." She looked up then, her eyes shining with something like guilt, something like resolve. "I can help," she said, "with whatever you're doing. I don't want you to face them alone." I rested my hand over hers. "Thank you, but right now I just need to take back what's mine." She squeezed my fingers gently. "Then I'm with you." The house felt different then, not restored, not healed, but steadier. As if someone had placed a lamp inside a dark room, and the shadows had stepped back just enough to let me see where I was standing. Chloe stayed for tea. We talked about her classes, her job, her little apartment downtown with the leaky faucet and mismatched chairs. She laughed, and I felt the air lighten, just a little. After she left, the house grew quiet again, but not the same hollow quiet as before. A quieter layer now sat beneath it, strength, maybe, or simply readiness. Tomorrow, my attorney would begin filing the paperwork. Tomorrow, the process of reclaiming what had been taken would begin in earnest. But tonight, I locked the doors again, washed my cup, and stood for a long time in the dim light of the kitchen, listening to the house settle around me. This time, the silence didn't feel empty at all. The next morning I woke before the alarm, long before the sun had lifted itself over the rooftops. Age does that to you. Sleep becomes a visitor instead of a resident. I lay still for a while, listening to the faint hum of the house. It felt steadier today, as if the walls themselves understood that something had shifted, that I was no longer waiting for someone else to decide my fate. I got up slowly, dressed, and ate a small breakfast, though food had little taste these days. Then I gathered the documents my attorney asked for, slipped them into a large envelope, and placed it on the passenger seat of my old car. The same car Mark once teased me about. "Mom, why don't you get something modern?" he'd said. Funny how the things he dismissed had turned out to be the ones I could rely on. My attorney's office was quieter today. Attorney Mills greeted me with a firm nod, motioning me inside as if we were partners in a shared task rather than a client and advisor. She took the envelope from my hands, sat, and spread the pages across her desk with the precision of someone who knew exactly what battle she was about to fight. "We're filing the formal notice today," she said. "Once it's submitted, your son cannot make any claim to act on your behalf, and the police report will help establish improper use of the power of attorney." Her voice was calm, but I could hear the steel underneath it. I wasn't used to people defending me so directly. It stirred something inside me, something that had been dormant for years, the belief that I was still worth defending. She drafted a letter to Mark as well. It was short, clear, emotionless, all authority revoked. Cease all attempts to access property, return belongings, or disclose location. Clinical phrases for a deeply personal wound. When she handed me a copy, my hands tingled as if I were touching something electric. "We'll send this today," she said. "By certified mail, and email, if you'd like." "Yes," I said. "Email too. He always checks those faster." I tried to keep my voice steady, but inside I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. A revocation letter? For my own child. I had imagined many things when I became a mother, but not this. Before I left, Attorney Mills looked at me with a softness I hadn't expected. "Be prepared for him to push back. People don't like losing control they shouldn't have had in the first place." I nodded. "I understand." Outside, the day had brightened. The light felt different, cooler, but clearer. I drove back home with the windows cracked slightly, letting the wind move through the car like a cleansing breath. When I pulled into my driveway, a familiar unease flickered in my chest. I half expected to see another truck, another stranger carrying something of mine. But the yard was empty, still. My rose bush swayed lightly in the breeze, untouched. For the first time in days, I felt a small, careful relief seep into me. Inside, the phone was already buzzing on the counter. Mark again, then Lindsay, then Mark once more, as if layering calls might pierce my resolve. I let the phone buzz until it fell silent. I sat at the kitchen table, folded my hands, and waited for whatever feeling would come. Anger, grief, fear, any of them would have been understandable. But what rose instead was something quieter. I didn't need to answer every call. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to justify the simple truth that I had the right to my own home. The sunlight crept across the floor, warming the spaces where furniture had once stood. The gaps no longer looked like wounds, they looked like clean pages. Blank, but ready. I placed the new keys on the table in front of me. The metal gleamed softly in the light. For the first time since all this began, I let myself imagine that there might be a future here, one I chose, not one chosen for me. By the next afternoon, the house was warm with sunlight, almost deceptively peaceful. I sat at the table, reading over the copies of the filings Attorney Mills had sent me. The language was cold, factual, stripped of emotion, yet each line felt like a hand placed gently but firmly at the small of my back, guiding me forward. There was still one unanswered question. Where exactly had my belongings been taken? I knew the address scrawled on the mover's clipboard, but not what waited for me there. Attorney Mills had told me not to go alone. Not yet, she'd said. We'll request official access once the paperwork begins to move. But patience has never been one of age's gifts. I wanted to see it with my own eyes, not to confront anyone, not even to act, just to know. When you've had something stolen from you, even by someone who shares your blood, the worst part is the not knowing. I left the house quietly, making sure the new locks clicked behind me. The drive across town was strange. Familiar streets looked slightly altered, as though someone had rearranged the city while I wasn't watching. The address led me to a storage facility, a long row of red metal doors, all identical, all silent. The kind of place where people put things they don't want to deal with. I didn't get out of the car. Not yet. I just sat there, hands folded on the steering wheel, watching sunlight flicker on the doors. Somewhere behind one of them were my memories, my furniture, my husband's tools, the photo albums, the small cracks and chips in our belongings that only I would recognize. I imagined Mark signing the forms, maybe rushed, maybe annoyed, maybe certain I'd never object. I wondered if he'd even stepped inside the unit or if he'd simply handed the entire task to strangers. For him, perhaps, these things were items. For me, they were a life. I stayed there until the ache in my chest softened into something quieter. Then I started the car and drove away without stepping out. Seeing the place had been enough for now. I would return soon, with the sheriff, and with the authority that belonged to me all along. Back home, the phone was ringing again. I let it ring until silence returned. Minutes later, a text arrived. Mark, Mom, we need to talk. This is getting out of hand. I put the phone face down on the counter. I brewed myself tea, breathing slowly as the steam curled upward. It was strange how ordinary motions, tea, warm water, the weight of a mug, anchored me more than any legal document. The body remembers safety even when the mind is unsettled. While I drank, someone knocked. 3 polite taps. Chloe, again. I opened the door and she walked in without waiting for an invitation, worry etched across her young face. Grandma, Dad is losing it. He knows you revoked everything. He says he's trying to protect you, but now he's just angry. I know, I said quietly. Anger is often the first reaction when people lose a power they shouldn't have had. She sat at the table, pulling her sleeves over her hands the way she did when she felt small. I told him he was wrong. I told him he crossed the line. I reached across the table and touched her wrist. That took courage. She shook her head. He just stared at me, like he didn't recognize me. Or maybe like he didn't expect me to pick anyone but him. I exhaled slowly. Your father has lived a long time believing he was the only one allowed to decide what was best for everyone around him. That's exactly what he said, she murmured. I'm doing what's best for her. He didn't even call you Mom, just her. Her voice cracked on the last word. The sight of tears forming in her eyes unsettled me more than anything my son had done. Chloe, I said softly, none of this is your fault, and none of this is yours to mend. She nodded, wiping her eyes. Still, I want to help. Tell me what to do. I took a breath, choosing the words carefully. Right now, all I need is someone who sees me. Not as a burden, not as a problem, not as an inconvenience, just as myself. I do, she whispered. I know, I said. The house seemed to soften around us then, as if acknowledging her presence. After Chloe left, I walked into the living room, letting the quiet settle again. The sun was slipping lower, painting long stripes across the bare floor. I watched the light reach toward the place where my sofa had once been. It struck me with a kind of gentle certainty that the room wasn't ruined. It was waiting, and so was I. 2 days later, Attorney Mills called just after breakfast. I had been standing in the living room, looking at the empty places where my life had once fit so neatly. I almost didn't hear the phone over the sound of the wind pressing against the windows. Mrs. Parker, she said, her voice brisk but warm. The temporary protective order has been approved. Your son is barred from removing, selling, or altering any of your property. We've also filed a formal request for law enforcement assistance to inspect the storage unit. I closed my eyes for a moment. Relief isn't always a rush. Sometimes it's a slow exhale that reaches the bones. Thank you, I said quietly. She continued. The sheriff's office will contact you with a date. It should be soon. They want you present, but they'll handle the interaction. I thanked her again, hung up, and stood in the quiet house with the phone still in my hand. It was strange how safety, once regained, didn't feel triumphant. It felt like a tired woman sitting down at last after standing too long. The house creaked gently, maybe settling, maybe listening. Around noon, I stepped outside to check the mailbox. A thin envelope with my name typed on the front waited there like a snake coiled in plain sight. I didn't need to flip it over to know who it was from. Mark Parker. Sent overnight. I stood by the mailbox, holding it without opening it. The air smelled like damp leaves. A storm had passed in the night. My rose bush looked bent, but not broken. Funny how that mirrored so much. Inside, I opened the envelope with a knife. Not out of ceremony, but because my fingers felt too tired for the tearing. His letter was short. 2 paragraphs, each more defensive than the last. He wrote that he couldn't watch me decline any longer, that the house was unsafe, that my refusal to move was emotionally manipulative. Not once did he ask how I felt. Not once did he apologize for the movers. It was a careful letter, the kind someone writes after speaking to an attorney of their own. I folded it neatly and set it on the counter. Not to keep, to remember. The afternoon stretched quiet and long. I cleaned the kitchen despite it not needing much cleaning. Old women do that. We clean when we don't know what to do with feelings. I wiped surfaces, washed the single cup I'd used, replaced it in the cabinet. The small, ordinary motions steadied my hands. Then another knock came. Not Chloe's soft triple tap. This one was sharp, impatient, like knuckles hitting with purpose. I opened the door just enough to see Lindsay standing on the porch, arms crossed over her chest, hair perfectly arranged, expression tight as a drawn string. Helen, she said. Her voice clipped. She didn't say Mom. She never had. Lindsay, I replied, keeping the door where it was. She sighed as if the whole world were a burden she alone carried. This is getting ridiculous. Mark is beside himself. You've embarrassed him with these filings. I let the words settle between us, heavy and stale. He embarrassed himself, I said calmly. I simply told the truth. We were trying to help you, she snapped. You weren't coping well. You forget things. You fall. You repeat yourself. I held her gaze. I repeat myself because people like you don't listen the first time. For the first time since I'd known her, She blinked. A tiny fracture in her controlled expression. "We're family," she said, but there was a brittleness to it. "We were doing what was necessary." "Necessary for whom?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she shifted her weight, looking past me into the half-empty house. "This place is too much for you." "This place," I said quietly, "is mine." Her lips tightened. "If you think you can drag this into court without consequences—" "I don't want a fight," I interrupted. "But I will not be moved out of my home like furniture left on the curb." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Something flickered in her eyes. Anger, then calculation. I saw the moment she realized nothing she said would move me. "Fine," she said coldly, "then handle it your way." She walked down the steps with stiff, clipped strides. I didn't watch her drive off. I simply closed the door and locked it. Inside, the house exhaled again, as if relieved she had gone. Later, as the sun lowered itself across the front yard, I made tea and sat by the bare living room wall. The floorboards glowed amber in the fading light. I watched the shadows shift and thought how strange it was that a home could feel wounded and healing at the same time. The sheriff would be calling soon, and when he did, I would be ready. The call came early the next morning, just as the sky was turning from gray to the first shy blue of the day. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped around a cup of warm water. Tea felt too heavy for my stomach. When the phone rang, I knew before answering who it was. "This is Deputy Harland with the county sheriff's office," a calm voice said. "We received the court order regarding your property. We'll meet you at the storage facility today at 11 o'clock. You are not to engage with your son if he appears. Understood?" "Yes," I said. My voice came out steady. I was proud of that. "Thank you." After he hung up, I remained seated for a few moments, letting the reality settle in. I was going to see my things again. Not knowing their condition had been like carrying a stone in my chest. Today, I would at least know. At 10:30, I left the house, checking twice that the doors were locked. The new keys felt sure in my hand. I drove slowly, keeping both hands on the wheel, watching the quiet Saturday streets glide past. The same grocery store where I'd bought fruit with Mark when he was little. The library where my husband and I spent quiet evenings in the winter. All of it familiar, and yet my chest felt as if it belonged to someone else, someone older and more bruised by life than I had ever expected to become. The storage facility appeared at the end of a long stretch of road lined with warehouses. When I pulled in, 2 sheriff's vehicles were already waiting. A tall deputy in a brown uniform walked toward me with a clipboard tucked under his arm. "Mrs. Parker," he said, offering a polite nod. "We'll escort you to the unit. You are not required to lift anything today. We're here to document the condition and contents." "I appreciate that," I said. He guided me toward the row of units. The metal doors gleamed coldly in the late morning light. Each one looked identical, as if my memories had been swallowed by a long corridor of sameness. The deputy stopped at Unit 147. "This the number you saw on the mover's paperwork?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He tapped gently on the door with his knuckles, then turned the latch with a master key. The metal groaned upward, inch by inch, until the space inside revealed itself like a wound. My breath caught. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, leaning at odd angles. My dining chairs had been shoved sideways against the wall. The bedside table was scratched along the surface, as if something heavy had been dragged over it. And there, propped against a crate, was the old photograph of my husband and me. The frame cracked, The image bowed upward like it was trying to breathe. I stepped forward, feeling the deputy's eyes on me but grateful for their silence. I touched the table with the tips of my fingers. The wood was cold. My husband had sanded that table himself one summer, smoothing every inch until it gleamed. Seeing it mishandled stirred something fierce and ancient in me, something I hadn't felt since the day I buried him. Deputy Harland cleared his throat softly. "We're photographing everything for the report. Once that's done, you'll be allowed to remove any items you want, or we can schedule movers of your choosing." "Not today," I said. "I only need to look." He nodded and stepped aside, giving me space. I moved slowly through the maze of boxes. Some were labeled neatly, others were scribbled in haste. One simply said "Misk," as if the word could contain decades of living. I found the box with my Christmas ornaments, the ones my granddaughter loved helping me hang. A ceramic angel lay broken inside. I pressed my lips together and kept going. Further back, I found the drawer of my dresser. The dresser itself was missing, but the drawer had been tossed loose on top of a trunk. Inside, beneath a folded sweater, lay the note my husband once left for me about the furnace filter. Somehow, even after all this, that small scrap of paper had survived. That felt like a kind of mercy. "Mrs. Parker," the deputy said quietly, "is everything here yours?" "Yes," I said, touching the edge of the drawer. "Everything." "We'll classify it as a full retrieval case then," he said. "No ambiguity." I appreciated how careful he was. Too many people these days rush through things, assuming they knew better. I took one more slow look around the unit. So much of my life reduced to a storage cube. Yet something inside me stiffened with clarity. These things were not abandoned. They were waiting. Deputy Harland lowered the door halfway. "When you're ready," he said, "we'll begin the formal process of returning your belongings." "I'm ready," I said, though the truth was that readiness was not a feeling, but a decision. He nodded gently and slid the door shut with a firm clang. The sound echoed through the corridor, and for the first time since this all began, I felt the weight in my chest shift and lift, if only by an ounce. By Monday morning, the house felt strangely alive again, though nothing had changed in its appearance. Maybe it was simply the knowledge that things were finally moving in a direction I chose. I moved through the kitchen with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. Even the sound of the kettle boiling seemed sharper, clearer, as if the house were waking up with me. Attorney Mills called just after 9. "The sheriff's documentation is complete," she said. "It strengthens your case significantly. The next step is securing your financial independence. We should review all accounts, income sources, and any joint access your son might still have." I agreed to meet her that afternoon. After hanging up, I collected my bank statements, insurance forms, and the folders that had always seemed too complicated to touch. My hands were steady as I slid them into a tote bag. There was no room left now for the helplessness I'd once allowed to guide me. Before I left the house, the phone buzzed. Mark again. I let it ring out, but a message followed almost immediately. "We need to talk. I didn't mean for this to go so far. Call me." I stared at the words for a long moment. There had been a time when my heart would have softened instantly at any sign of contrition. But now, all I could see was the difference between regret and responsibility. Regret is cheap. Responsibility requires repair. I placed the phone face down and walked out. The attorney's office felt more familiar this time. Mills spread my documents across her desk as though building a map of my life, one that she intended to redraw with stronger borders. She pointed out which accounts were vulnerable, which credit lines needed to be frozen, which automatic payments required new authorizations. "You've been very trusting," she said gently. "Most people are with family." "I thought trust was something you gave," I said, "not something you had to defend." She glanced up at me. "It's both." We spent nearly an hour reviewing forms. I signed papers revoking Mark's access to everything: checking, savings, insurance, utilities. Each signature felt like reclaiming a room in my home. When Mills handed me a final sheet to authorize an alert system so that I'd be notified of any financial activity in my name, I felt a tired but solid pride. "You're doing everything right," she said, "and you're doing it calmly." That will matter. Calm. Yes, but calm was not the same as unhurt. When I left the office and stepped into the afternoon light, I allowed myself to breathe as though the air had a taste again. The breeze carried the scent of cut grass, maybe from the park across the street. I watched two children racing each other along the sidewalk, their laughter rising and falling in careless rhythm. For a moment, I envied them, their unbroken futures, their certainty that adults would always do right by them. Back home, the living room was still bare, but it felt less like evidence of loss and more like potential. I stood in the doorway, letting my eyes settle on the wide open space where the sofa once sat. It no longer hurt to look at it. Emptiness can be its own kind of beginning. The phone buzzed again, not a call this time, but a long message from Mark. I didn't open it. I didn't need to read more justifications, more explanations shaped like apologies, but hollow inside. Instead, I placed the phone on the mantel where the old picture frame had hung. It felt symbolic somehow, as though he belonged outside the center of my life until he learned how to return without taking something from me. I spent the next hour tidying the kitchen, wiping down the counters even though they were already clean. My movements were slow, deliberate. I could hear my husband's voice faintly in my mind, his quiet, patient way of doing things. He had always believed that dignity was kept in the small routines, in how you tended your space, even when no one was watching. Later, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and stared out at the backyard. The grass shimmered under the late sun, gentle and soft, and a bird perched on the fence as if keeping watch. The house around me was still wounded, still missing pieces, but it was mine again. And that meant something. As the evening settled in, a soft fullness rose in me. Not happiness, not yet, but a steadier kind of peace. The kind that comes when you stop waiting for someone to save you and start saving yourself. Inch by inch, signature by signature, breath by breath. I let the quiet fill the room and stayed there until the light faded. The house settled into a gentler rhythm over the next few days, as if it had finally accepted the shift happening within its walls. I moved through each room slowly, not rushing anything, letting myself feel the space instead of mourning what used to fill it. Grief and recovery often look the same from the outside, but inside, they are different currents. One drags you down, the other steadies your feet. On Wednesday morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. It was as if my mind had swept itself clean overnight. I made oatmeal, ate half of it, and set the bowl in the sink. Then I opened the windows. Fresh air carried the scent of damp grass and a faint sweetness from the early buds on the trees. The house breathed with me. A knock came mid-morning, soft, hesitant, not Chloe's pattern, but close. When I opened the door, a young woman stood there holding a folder and a purse tucked under her arm. Her hair was pinned back neatly, her smile polite, but warm. "Mrs. Parker? I'm Emily." Your attorney said I should stop by with some documents for you to sign. She must have been one of the paralegals. I let her in, and she took a seat at the kitchen table. As she opened the folder and began explaining the forms, I found myself watching her hands, steady, capable, respectful. It mattered more than it should have. After so many days of having my choices treated like inconveniences, simple respect felt like grace. These outline the protections we've put in place, she explained. There's also a declaration confirming your competence, signed by your physician. It was required for the court filings. I nodded slowly. My doctor had always been gentle with me. He'd asked all the necessary questions, not to test me, but to ensure I wasn't being cornered by anyone's assumptions. I answered each one clearly, and he signed the document without hesitation. Reading his statement now, I felt a quiet vindication, not triumphant, just steadying. Emily slid the papers toward me. I signed each one carefully, my handwriting uneven but strong. When we finished, she gathered the pages neatly. "If you need anything at all," she said, "please call." I thanked her and walked her to the door. When it closed behind her, I felt the house shift again, lighter, as if paperwork had weight, and some of it had finally been lifted. I spent the afternoon tending to small repairs I had been putting off, tightening a loose cabinet hinge, sweeping the front porch, watering the plants that had survived the winter despite my neglect. The movements were slow but solid. This was how a life reclaimed itself, not through grand gestures, but through quiet maintenance. Later, as the sun began to drop behind the neighboring roofs, I decided to take a walk around the block. I hadn't done that in weeks. My legs felt stiff at first, then steadier with each step. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of pine from somewhere down the street. A neighbor, Mrs. Howard, waved from her yard. She was trimming her hedges, her back slightly hunched with age, but her movements precise. "Helen, haven't seen you out in a while," she called. I walked over to the fence. "I've been dealing with a few things," I said simply. She gave me a long, knowing look, the kind women of our age exchange when they understand that life's burdens are rarely the ones spoken aloud. "You let me know if you need anything," she said. "My grandson visits on weekends. He's strong as an ox. He'll help if you ever need heavy lifting." I thanked her, touched by the offer, though I didn't need the help just yet. Still, it warmed me. Kindness offered without expectation lands differently than help that comes with a plan attached. When I returned home, the living room glowed with the last light of the day. The empty spaces no longer looked like accusations. They looked like possibilities. I imagined where I might put things once they were returned. Not exactly as before. Some pieces needed to stay in the past, but in a way that felt right for the woman I was becoming now. I sat down at the table with a fresh cup of tea and let the warmth settle into my hands. Outside, the street grew quiet, except for the faint chirping of birds settling into the trees for the night. I didn't feel victorious. Victory was never the point. What I felt instead was something firmer. The sense that, after a long season of being pushed and ignored, I had finally taken a step back into myself. The house held that quiet with me, and together we waited for whatever came next. It was late Thursday afternoon when the knock came, loud, hurried, the kind that announces trouble before the person behind the door even speaks. I was in the living room, folding a blanket I kept on the armchair, though the armchair itself was gone. For a moment I just stood there, listening. I already knew who it was. Some knocks carry a person's entire temperament in them. When I opened the door, Mark was standing on the porch, breathing heavily, as if he had rushed over without stopping to think. His face looked drawn, the shadows under his eyes deeper than I remembered. He wasn't angry yet. Not exactly. But he was stretched thin, like a man who had spent days trying to force a world back into the shape he wanted. "Mom," he said, pushing one hand through his hair. "We need to talk." "I don't think we do," I replied, keeping my voice level. He stepped forward slightly, stopping only when he realized I wasn't moving aside. My hand rested on the doorframe, not blocking him, just reminding him that the threshold was mine, not his. "Please," he said. "You've put me in a terrible position. The legal filings, the sheriff, the accusations. This has gotten completely out of control." "Out of your control," I corrected. He blinked, taken aback. "Mom, I never meant for any of this to blow up. I was trying to help you. I thought you weren't managing well. You seemed overwhelmed. You fell. You forgot to pay the gas bill last spring." "I forgot once," I said quietly, "and I paid it the same day." He let out a strained breath. "This house is too much for you. You can't live like this forever. I was trying to protect you." I studied his face. Beneath all the frustration was something else. A flicker of fear, maybe. Not for me, but for what he believed he was owed. And perhaps for the first time, I saw him clearly, without the blur of maternal hope. "You hired movers while I was at church," I said. "You emptied my home without my consent. That isn't protection, Mark. That's control." He looked away, jaw tightening. "You weren't thinking straight. I just needed to get things started. Once you saw the new place, you'd understand." "I understand perfectly," I said. "You made a decision that wasn't yours to make." His eyes came back to mine, sharp now, wounded in the way pride is wounded before the heart ever gets touched. "You talked to lawyers before talking to me." "You lied before talking to me," I replied. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence between us settled like dust. Something in him sagged, just a little. "I'm drowning, Mom," he said finally. His voice dropped, softer than I'd heard in years. "The mortgage, the car payments, the medical bills, Chloe's college. I thought selling the house would solve everything. I thought you'd be safe. And we'd all be stable." So there it was, not malice, not cruelty. Just desperation rearranged into justification. But desperation doesn't make theft into caretaking. It doesn't make manipulation into love. "I'm sorry you're struggling," I said, meaning it. "But my home is not your solution." His shoulders slumped. "You don't understand what pressure I'm under." "I understand more than you think," I said. "I've lived long enough to know what it looks like when someone hides their fear behind certainty. But your fear does not give you rights over my life." He looked past me into the living room, at the empty spaces where furniture had been. Pain flickered across his features. Maybe guilt, maybe resentment, maybe both tangled together so tightly he could no longer separate them. "Mom, I don't want to fight with you," he said. "I don't want to fight with you either," I answered. "I want you to respect me." A long silence followed. For the first time, he looked unsure. Not defeated, only human. It softened something in me, but not enough to undo what needed to remain firm. "I'll talk to my attorney," he finally muttered. "That's your choice," I said, "but mine is already made." He nodded stiffly, as if he were swallowing a bitter pill. Then he turned and walked down the porch steps, slower than he'd arrived. I watched him go, but not in the way a mother watches a child leave. more like a woman watching someone finally step off a road they should never have forced her onto. When he drove away, the quiet that followed was almost warm. The house stood behind me, patient and steady, as if waiting for me to close the door on something much larger than the conversation. I did. The morning after Mark's visit, the house felt heavier than usual, as if it had absorbed every word spoken on the porch. I moved slowly through the rooms, touching the door frames, the windowsills, the familiar grooves in the floor. The quiet wasn't sharp anymore. It had softened into something reflective. Pain has a way of settling once it's named. By noon, I had decided on something that had been circling my thoughts for days. The house didn't just need repairs and returned furniture. It needed new life inside it. I needed new life inside it. The attorney had mentioned once, almost in passing, that many older women rent out a spare room, not out of financial desperation, but because having another presence in the house keeps loneliness from slipping into the walls. I didn't want a stranger. I wanted someone who wouldn't talk down to me, someone whose footsteps wouldn't sound like intrusion. As I made tea, I thought of Chloe telling me about one of her friends, a young woman named Lily studying nursing, too afraid to sign a lease on a studio she couldn't really afford. I sent a message to Chloe. "Would your friend still be looking for a room?" She replied within minutes. "Yes, she'd love that. I can bring her by today if you want." My hands warmed around the mug. It felt like the house was listening. When Chloe and Lily arrived later that afternoon, the air shifted. Lily was soft-spoken, with careful eyes that noticed more than she allowed people to see. She kept her hands clasped in front of her, as if afraid to disturb anything. "This is beautiful," she said gently as she walked through the hallway, even though half the furniture was still missing. I appreciated that she didn't try to pretend the emptiness wasn't there. She simply took it in and continued. We sat at the kitchen table, and she told me about her clinical rotations, her long shifts, her difficulty sleeping in an apartment where the neighbors' music shook the walls. She spoke like someone who had learned to be steady in chaos. "I'm not looking for much," she said. "Just somewhere quiet. Somewhere that feels safe." Her words landed softly but deeply. Safety. Such a simple thing, yet so easy to lose when the wrong hands take authority in your life. "I have a spare room," I said. "It's small but bright in the mornings, and I don't mind a quiet companion." She smiled. A real one, not the polite kind. "I'd be grateful." I showed her the room as it was now, clean, empty, waiting. She ran her fingers along the windowsill, nodding as if she could already see her things placed neatly inside. "I can move in this weekend," she said. "Only if it's not too soon." "It isn't too soon," I replied. "It's time the house heard someone else's footsteps again." Chloe hugged me before they left, whispering, "I'm proud of you." Her voice trembled the way it always did when she felt too much at once. I told her she had nothing to be proud for, only something to be proud with. Strength isn't inherited, it's practiced. After they drove off, the house felt different. Not fuller, but more open, like a space ready to welcome possibility. I walked to the spare room and stood in the doorway, imagining the bed I would bring back from the storage unit, the curtains I'd choose, the small lamp that used to sit on my husband's nightstand. A room could be both memory and renewal if tended with intention. As evening settled, I brewed another cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the neighbors' porch lights flicker on one by one. The street was quiet, and for the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't press down on me. It rested beside me, companionable. This house had seen so much. Joy, grief, the slow wearing down that comes with time, and now the slow rising back up. I touched the arm of the chair and allowed myself a small, steady breath. There was a future forming here, one I could shape with my own hands. Lily moved in on Saturday morning, carrying 2 suitcases and a box with a small potted fern she said she had kept alive against all odds. I liked her for that alone. Anyone who tends to fragile things with such determination understands more about life than most people ever will. The house reacted to her arrival almost immediately. The air felt lighter, the rooms less hollow. Even the floorboards seemed to soften under her careful steps. She spent the afternoon unpacking while I worked in the living room, dusting shelves that would soon hold my returned things. We didn't talk much, just gentle exchanges through open doorways, the way people do when they are learning each other's rhythms. By evening, her laughter drifted down the hallway as she spoke quietly on the phone. It didn't intrude. It added something warm. The next day, Chloe came by with groceries and stayed for tea. She looked around the house, taking in the changes. The open windows, the faint scent of lemon from the cleaner Lily had brought. The sense that someone new had stepped into the empty spaces and filled them without crowding anything. "It feels different in here," she said. "It does," I agreed. "Different can be good." She nodded, though her expression was thoughtful, almost cautious. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "Dad's been quieter. He hasn't talked to me about you since that day on your porch." I stirred my tea slowly. Quieter can mean he's thinking, or avoiding, or both. "He's embarrassed," she said. "Not that he did something wrong, just that people found out." I sighed, not out of exhaustion, but acceptance. Some people mistake shame for reflection. They aren't the same. She reached across the table, resting her hand on mine. "I'm glad you're not alone anymore." I smiled at her. I wasn't alone. I was simply learning how to hear myself again. Later that evening, after Chloe left, I stood in the spare room doorway, watching Lily arrange her books on a narrow shelf. She had placed the fern on the windowsill where the afternoon sun would reach it. The room looked lived in already, though lightly, respectfully. She turned when she sensed me there. "I hope I'm not in your way," she said. "Not at all," I replied. "This house needed someone who sees it." She gave a small smile, then returned to her books. I walked back to the kitchen, feeling an odd mixture of peace and readiness settle inside me. As the week unfolded, a new routine took shape. Lily left early for her shifts, moving quietly so she wouldn't wake me. In the evenings, she often stopped by the kitchen to tell me small stories from the hospital. Nothing dramatic, just kind observations about patients or coworkers. Sometimes we ate together, sometimes we didn't. It was a gentle coexistence, one that filled the house without swallowing it. One night, while we washed dishes side by side, she said, "I hope you don't mind, but your granddaughter mentioned what happened with your son." She didn't give details, just that you'd been through something hard. I dried a plate, placing it carefully in the cabinet. "It's all right. There's no shame in having lived through a difficult moment." She hesitated. "You seem strong. I want to be like that when I'm older." I shook my head. "Strength isn't a personality trait. It's a decision you make over and over when life doesn't give you the kindness you deserve." She absorbed that quietly, the way thoughtful people do. That night, after she went to her room, I lingered in the hallway. The air smelled faintly of lavender from the candle she'd lit. The house, for the first time in many months, felt layered with life instead of loss. There were still empty spaces where my things should be, and the court process wasn't finished yet, but the loneliness that had crept into the corners had loosened its grip. I sat by the front window with a cup of tea and watched the neighborhood settle for the night. A couple walked their dog past my house. A porch light flicked on across the street. The slow rhythm of ordinary life moved around me, steady and unhurried. For years, I'd believed that growing older meant shrinking into smaller and smaller rooms of your own life. But now, in this house that had almost been taken from me, with one young woman unpacking her books down the hall and my granddaughter's loyalty anchoring me more firmly than I expected, I felt something open instead. Not wide, not loudly, just enough. Sunday came soft and slow, the way early spring Sundays sometimes do, with a pale sun rising behind a thin veil of clouds. I dressed without hurry. Choosing the cardigan my husband always said brought out the calm in my face. I hadn't worn it in months. Grief has a way of burying small comforts, but life, once steadied, brings them back within reach. Church felt different this morning, not because the sermon was new or the hymns were sung any differently, but because I walked in carrying only myself. Not fear, not worry, not the weight of someone else's plans. The women I'd known for years greeted me with warm hands and knowing smiles. A few had heard pieces of what happened. Small towns have a way of circulating truth without details, compassion without intrusion. After the service, I lingered on the steps, watching families gather and disperse. Chloe joined me there, slipping her arm through mine. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't need to. She simply stayed close, and that was enough. When she drove away, promising to come by later in the week, I stood for a moment longer before heading home. The drive felt familiar again. Not a place I was escaping from or returning to out of obligation, but a route leading back to a life I had refused to surrender. When I turned onto my street, the sight of my house filled me with a warmth that was almost startling. It looked steadier than before, as though it had grown into itself again while I wasn't looking. Inside, Lily was finishing her meal before leaving for her evening shift. She smiled when she saw me. "Good service?" she asked. "Yes," I said. It was. She gathered her things and left quietly, her footsteps fading into the still air. After she was gone, I walked into the living room. Sunlight poured through the windows, touching the floors with soft gold. The room was still sparsely furnished, but the emptiness no longer felt like loss. It felt like possibility, as though the house were giving me space to build something new rather than mourn what had been broken. I sat in the armchair, the temporary one I had brought down from the guest room, and listened to the quiet. Not the sharp silence of fear, but a calm one, shaped by breath and time. A silence earned. My thoughts wandered to Mark, not with bitterness, but with a kind of sad clarity. I knew he was struggling. I knew he felt cornered by his own choices. But I had finally learned something it took me 72 years to understand. Love does not mean surrendering your life so someone else can fix theirs. Love can hold compassion without forfeiting boundaries. It can hope for someone without handing them the keys to your dignity. I wished him well. I wished him growth. But I no longer wished to be the cost of it. The afternoon settled, stretching in a warm, gentle line across the floor. I closed my eyes, breathing evenly. When I opened them again, the room felt just a little fuller, as if the house had taken a breath of its own. Later, I walked outside and tended to the rose bush by the front steps. It had survived the winter better than expected. New buds were forming already, small and determined. I clipped away the dead stems, careful not to rush. Renewal demands patience, even in plants, even in people. When I went back inside, evening had begun to settle. The lamp on the table cast a soft glow across the living room. I stood there for a moment, looking at the house that had almost been emptied of me, and felt a deep, balanced strength rise quietly inside my chest. I reclaimed my home. I reclaimed my voice. And in doing so, I reclaimed the woman I had nearly forgotten I was. Steady, capable, unwilling to be moved like a piece of furniture when life becomes inconvenient to others. Women my age carry storms inside them, and sometimes we forget we are allowed to lay them down. But we are. And when we do, the world becomes wider again. If my story reminds you of your own, or if you've ever felt pushed out of the life you built, tell me. Tell your story. It matters, and so do you.